Welcome, everyone, to VR and AR through an ethical lens. My name is Jyoti Patel. I am a facilitator and organizational designer here in Seattle, and I facilitate playful workshops in culture and strategy that hopefully address a lot of the issues that are coming up here today. So today, I was really hoping to kind of walk us through a flow for this panel that kind of starts out talking about the problems and then a little bit about how organizations and our systems are responding to those problems, and then end out with a little bit of a focus on where we should focus our priorities in terms of building solutions. So I will briefly introduce our panelists just by name, and then I'm going to hand it over to them to introduce themselves in a little bit more detail. So join me in welcoming Dan Robbins, who's a principal UX designer at HTC Vive. Fiona McEvoy, who's a tech researcher and founder of YouTheData.com. She does some really great work. And Trond Nilsen, who's the director of development at Virtual Therapeutics. So guys, please introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your experience as it relates to the area of VR and AR.
Hi, so I'm Fiona Jane McEvoy, as Jyoti said. I am a tech ethics researcher and writer and founder of YouTheData.com, which is really just a blogging platform that I've been running for a couple of years now that looks at the ethical and societal implications of AI and any sort of new and emerging technology. I'm also kind of a media commentator. I've written for Slate and VentureBeat and other publications like that. And lastly, I'm an independent scholar, which means that I write, present, and publish academic papers, but I'm not kind of tethered to any particular academic institution. In terms of my interest in VR, I've written about it a few times. I actually wrote, I think, 5 ethical concerns. I can't remember how many it was now for augmented reality a little while ago, which a lot of people took and ran with, which was great. I wrote a piece for Slate on augmented reality in the context of property rights, so where can we augment? And most recently, I have written a paper which I'm presenting in Mexico City in a couple of weeks' time at the annual conference of the International Association of Computing and Philosophy. And that's called AI-Driven Behavior Change and the Parameters of Ethical Permissibility, which is kind of a long way of saying that I'm looking at kind of nudge technique and where we overstep the boundaries of that within and more immersive environments. So yeah, that's me.
Cool. So I'm Trond. I'm, as Jyoti said, the Director of Development at Virtual Therapeutics. I am a bit of a jack of all trades. I started out originally as a sort of a software engineer, moved into research and augmented and virtual reality through the HIT Lab New Zealand, and then later through the HIT Lab at the University of Washington. I started getting involved in community organising, so I help run a lot of local community groups, hackathons, discussion groups and so forth. And more recently, I've been involved at Virtual Therapeutics, directing the development there of virtual reality content focused around therapies for addressing chronic stress, chronic anxiety, and chronic pain.
Good afternoon, Dan Robbins. Thank you for being here. So I'm one of the bad guys. I am at a company that is making or will be making the devices that people will be wearing on their faces that will prevent us from being in the moment, that will prevent us from being connected to people, that will prevent us from being more introspective, and will prevent us from being in the now. That said, this is an opportunity for you and the broader communities to influence these kinds of things before they are fully developed. I want to apologize for smartphones. Some of the people in this room have worked on them, and now we have a world of The Walking Dead where we are walking around looking at these devices that are taking us away from things that potentially matter and impact us not only physically, but emotionally and spiritually. I hope that we can develop guidelines and frameworks for designing these things crazily before they actually exist, which is why I'm starting to think about these as AR is still at the very formative stages. And I also want to invite you to understand that if you go to one of these panels or one of these talks and people get up here and they say, this is the answer, this is what you need to do about AR or VR, they're either lying or they're delusional. We don't, or they're trying to sell you something. We don't know yet. We are trying to figure this out. But also there are people who've thought about these things for thousands of years, about ethics and philosophy and different ways of thinking from different communities. So as technologists, many of us coming up in the world may not have felt that empowered. Now we are at the top in Seattle, San Francisco, when we feel like we have the answer. So I invite those of you like me who are makers to step back and invite more voices into the room. Thank you.
Wonderful. So my first question is about exploring the problem. So esteemed panelists, please describe an example of ethical challenges that have come up with the development and usage of AR, VR technology. And if you could, please kind of connect the dots to what flavor of issue it is.
Yeah, so sort of dipping into my paper, because that's what's at the forefront of my mind at the moment, of course. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in, and I don't think it's had enough airtime, is actually the influence of AR and VR on human psychology. So just to give you a little example, this isn't a new study. It's a study that was conducted by Stanford University a few years ago. They had a class of elementary school children, and they put them in a VR environment, right? So they all put the kind of goggles on. And they showed them an avatar of themselves swimming with orca whales, right? And so they watched this, great, wonderful. And then after a period of time, and I can't remember, it's like a couple of weeks or a month or something, they went back to this group of kids. And those children, or at least a certain percentage of them, remembered that experience as though it were a real experience. They recalled it as though they had swum with orca whales. That, I think, and there are other studies that have similar results, show you the potency of something like a virtual reality environment when it comes to undercutting our cognitive or exposing or exploiting our cognitive flaws. And so from my perspective, I'm very interested in how, if, indeed, as Wired magazine announced a couple of months ago, something like AR is the new platform that we're all going to be using. How can we mitigate troubling psychological impacts? How can we stop commercial entities that have different objectives to me and to you in our lives, exposing or exploiting those flaws and taking advantage of the incredible potency of these mechanisms? So that's something I'm interested in, and I think it's something that I certainly don't have the answers to, but I think we should be thinking about it.
I just turned 50, so I'm going to need to look at my notes. I apologize. I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to make you all depressed by listing a bunch of ethical issues that I deal with in my work daily, and then hopefully I'll give you some hope, or you guys can give me some hope. So the categories that I think about this, and I'm going to run through these very quickly, I apologize. So the first one I alluded to is around detachment. As we put these devices on in the future, we will have the ability to have rose-colored views of the world. I can have devices in the future that remove homeless people from my view, that remove sounds that I don't want to hear from my world. Sometimes that's for good. It might help me focus on doing my work. It might give me a sense of equanimity, but it also removes me from the full tapestry of the world around me. So consider that. Next one is around inequity, which you've heard a lot about today, but I'm going to give a specific part of that, which is these devices, for them to work well, have to be built on top of data models. Those data models are, of course, going to be built by the devices themselves. Where are those data sets being built? Which communities are going to be having these devices that are collecting the data is intrinsically important to this discussion. And then next one is about using AI as an invasive technology. So we will soon have the ability, when you put these on, to be able to do deep fakes in real time. So I can walk down the street and see all of you naked through inferred AI models of your physiques. Just consider that for a second. And I'm doing that without your consent. Desensitization. So as we understand the utility of violating privacy, and there's tons of utility around that, if we do that enough, unfortunately, then we are changing the standard of what privacy, of what permissible privacy actually is, because standards do change over time, and those are based on behavior. Next one I want to talk about is gaming the human in some sense. We talk a lot about nudging. So if different constituents are using these technologies to push us into certain directions, they are essentially gaming the built-in ways that we've evolved to deal with sensory input. And we have to grapple with that. Evolution is much, much slower than technological development, and we are essentially a flat curve, whereas technology is going up depending on your axis. So we have to understand that relationship. And then the last one I want to talk about, which many people allude to, is about dependence. So if we are using these wonderful devices to, not only tell me if my shoes fit or whether that couch looks good there or how do I get to certain places and services, have I lost the ability to do that? If I have these devices that are then coaching me on how to do emotional intelligence with people, have I lost the ability to do that myself? So those are sort of the dystopic views of what I grapple with every day. The way I'd like to, the counterpoint to that, though, a colleague of mine said is, we've been doing about, say, 50 years of dystopic science fiction. And his question was, or statement was, it hasn't worked. We're still here in this world. So maybe it's time to put aside some of this dystopic view and instead switch a little bit to aspirational and positive. So I invite you to help me feel better.
I half wonder, though, if the fact that we have been thinking dystopically is why we're still here. The fact that we're actually envisioning these situations and doing things about them, that we're making decisions about how we set the rules that we play by, the laws, the so forth. I don't know, that's just a quick reaction. As far as topics from my perspective, I was planning to sort of fill in the gaps between the sorts of things I was expecting Dan to talk about and what Fiona's been talking about, but it seems that we've actually covered an awful lot of them. So the main topic I'm interested in that hasn't been touched on is about governance and about how do we actually make the decisions on what is acceptable, who makes those decisions, and how do we implement those decisions in such a way that they stick. I'm from an engineering background. I think that way, so I want to know the practicalities of how we do this. I'm not as interested as maybe some people are in talking about these things. I mean, obviously I do like talking about them. I'm here talking, but what I mean is I find it's very easy to, I think in the last talk, Shankar was talking about how organizations, they'll set up ethics panels, they'll discuss things, they'll issue statements, and then when it comes to the rubber meeting the road, the policies that they back and the way they build their software ends up being completely counter to that. So there's an awful lot of, not greenwashing, not whitewashing, ethics washing, I don't know what colour ethics is, but that colour. So how we do that is, I think, really, really important. And I think there's some good steps in this direction that we might come to later. And there's another side of it as well, is not just how do we make sure that the large organizations are playing by rules that we all participate in, but also as we make these rules, making sure that we do so both in a way where we are incorporating viewpoints from all of the various people who are going to be affected, so not just listening to end users and developers, which seems to be how it goes, but also all the various stakeholders who are affected in between, the people who are around those end users, the people who are affected by the side effects of data collected from those end users, so that whole ecosystem sort of approach. And then on the other side of that, how do we make sure that when we do listen to everyone, we're able to equally balance the different perspectives in such a way that we reach a solid, well-thought-out outcome. It's important not to just react to the loudest voice in the room or the voice that has got the most narratively compelling argument right now. You need to think across this whole perspective and fact all these things. And I don't think this is easy. I don't think it's a thing we historically do, but I think it's a thing we need to do, and I think we're in this place with virtual and augmented reality where we are literally at the beginning of new worlds, and this seems to me to be the best place possible to try and set the rules of those worlds in such a way that it makes solving these problems easier within them. I don't think we can solve things easily, but I think that's my optimistic vision.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think we definitely covered some of the different aspects of the problem, in terms of the psychological and social components, and then the equity, especially from a data perspective and what might be informing them. Dan, one of the things that you mentioned in our conversation beforehand was the fact that augmented reality is going to be a lot more widely utilized than virtual reality. That's the way that it appears. And so one of the things I read about was just marketing, and when we think about social media marketing and how much that has shaped the way that technology has been used, I think marketing too is going to shape a lot of the way that AR is used. And yeah, one of the things I read about was Google issued a patent for pay per gaze. So the ability to be able to charge people depending on how many views they get on a particular ad in the AR universe. And in that same patent, there was also some verbiage about biofeedback. So being able to measure people's like pupil dilation in response to that advertising. So there's just a lot of, I think, potential for how this technology could grow, especially within that frame, in addition to the social and psychological pieces too. So now that we've kind of talked about the problem a little bit, let's talk about how organizations are responding. And Trond, you did kind of talk a little bit about this already. But what are some examples that you guys can share about how organizations are responding to this problem? And what's working, what's not working?
So I'll start since I've already alluded to something. First off, I don't really think many organizations are responding. I think small developers are generally engaging with these questions in a very enthusiastic way, particularly ones which are sort of less aiming to be picked up and funded and grow very fast. So less platform plays, less system plays, but more content creators. If you come to any of the events that we put on for Seattle VR, a lot of these issues are being discussed regularly, and people care about them greatly. It's not that we can, as through those groups, actually put these things into place in a way that would affect the world, but there's a lot of interest from the bottom up in those issues. I think the larger organizations, there are some sort of cross-organizational groups such as the XR Association and so forth. The VRARA is another one like that are attempting to put into place codes of ethics, and I think those are good things in principle. But the model I really like, and I would love for us to be able to address, is sort of taken from the sort of open standards type communities, where we essentially are working out, well, you bring together the people from various organizations who represent the interests of those organizations, but also are involved in either the design of or the implementation of specific technologies or specific, what I call reified policies in those spaces, and then they build rules that address all the various issues. They have stakeholder processes where they can listen to the public, and then they sort of lay out standard technologies for how different things talk to each other. I think there is always going to be, the risk is very different between how do you regulate things within a walled garden type approach, where one company controls everything about that virtual world or everything about virtual worlds in that AR layer or whichever particular technological frame you're using. Whereas if you start looking at places where we want to be able to communicate to each other, which is where a lot of value lies, I feel like that's a much more addressable place, because you can have these sorts of processes and there are incentives for one organization to play by the rules that everyone else plays by. Whereas if it's entirely their thing and we're just paying a tax to, say, Apple, then they'll choose the rules and they'll do what they want based on what gets them the most market share or money or whatever their particular incentive is. So that's my take. Who wants to go first?
So I don't work within these organisations, so I can't say what's working and what's not. I mean, I should say I really enjoyed some of the stuff that David was saying earlier about having more public stakeholders in the room, having more voices, letting it not just be these little pockets of, government and, Silicon Valley or the equivalent, and, indeed the dusty halls of academia, having these conversations and kind of throwing it open and inviting ordinary people to have more of a say. I think there's a lot about how we get people to trust in technology. That's a lot of the conversation at the moment. I go to tons of conferences, and this is one of the kind of workshop topics. How do we get people to trust in technology? I would challenge that slightly. I don't think we should be just kind of lulling people into a false sense of faith with the technologies that we're using. We should absolutely be teaching people to scrutinize the technologies that they're using, to try to get to grips with what it's doing, how it's understanding them, making sure they understand it. What data is it collecting? How is it using that data? How is it repurposing it in order to influence me one way or another? So yeah, just to add to that, I think there's, companies working in the AR and VR space would be very wise to try and anticipate unintended consequences, because it's not very hard to see how we could end up, with a kind of another Facebook whereby people have been manipulated, or, accusations, but, people have accused them of manipulation. I think we could end up in that position if we don't try to anticipate it. And I think there is room for regulation. I think there's room to lay down some parameters. But I do think it's really important that we involve ordinary people. There's a lot of technology being thrown at the general public at the moment, and not a hell of a lot being done to educate them on it. And I don't just mean school age or college age. Young people, I'm talking about mums and families, don't know enough about how this stuff actually works and how it operates.
I'll try to go back to the question a little bit about what's actually happening organizationally, at least from my point of view. So I'm going to take you a little bit into how the sausage is made. Many of those who are not embedded, who aren't paying the rent through tech like I am, we tend to see the failures, such as this thing didn't work or they didn't think through all this. But when you actually go into a lot of these organizations, most of the people working them actually are quite kind and do care about the world. But what happens is that we have to ship things. We have to ship them very quickly. And we always have limited resources and limited people that we can apply to things and limited time and confusion among stakeholders. So I'll give you an example. And that creates tensions between the desire to do, quote, the right thing for the broader community and then what you might think of as the right thing for business needs. So I worked on a social VR project a few years ago where I looked at a particular technology where people could interact in social VR, and I went into these systems, and no surprise, I encountered a ton of toxicity. It didn't matter how I was represented or voiced myself. Immediately I felt very unsafe, and I can only imagine what it's like for someone who isn't as privileged as I am. So through that experience, I started to develop a bunch of guidelines and proposals about, if we did this tweak and if we made that change and we surface this information to people in the system, we might try to incentivize positive behavior as opposed to punishing. So I brought this forth to the people who are on that team and the business leaders, and they said, well, that's all fair and great, but we have a set of users right now who really, really like the Wild West. They like freedom. They like anything goes, and if we put all these practices in place, they'll go away, and we'll lose all of our startup funding. And we will lose our press, and we will lose our ability to then eventually get to that place. So the lesson for me as a designer is understanding that even though I can't do everything right immediately, I need to keep that stuff in my back pocket because there will be a right time and a right place. And my job is to be that squeaky wheel, to keep bringing that conversation up over and over again and to say, hey, all these people in this room look like me, or hey, how about that thing where our user numbers are going to cap at this level because we aren't putting in some of these new positive incentives. So again, it's this disconnect between how the outside world views what happens and then often what happens on the inside. Also, sometimes what we need to do when we're first creating a new technology is we need to just try stuff. And it's impossible a priori to understand all unintended consequences. No matter how smart we are, no matter how many community charrettes you do, you just can't understand that. And likewise, because of that, it's also impossible to develop guidelines that accommodate every single situation. So what I recommend people do, instead of having guidelines, is instead we have frameworks. And this may sound like a semantic difference, but a guideline is saying something like, we have this rule. We will not say let kids under 13 do such and such, or we will make sure that everybody who wears AR glasses has the same view of the world. That's a rule, or that's sort of a line in the sand. A framework, instead, is a bunch of questions. If you start with a question, if you start with curiosity, you invite new ways of thinking about the world. And I'm going to just run through a bunch of these questions super quickly as a way of inspiring you to think about a framework as opposed to guidelines. So the one that I think is most interesting is when you're in a design meeting, when you're saying, should we do A or B? Because ultimately, this is all about decisions. I don't care what anybody else says. It's less about consequences. It's about the actual design decisions you're making in your group. So the most powerful one that I find is, are we as a product group willing to be accountable for the consequences of this decision? And that's a really tough one to face. And then the next one is this decision that we're making today, is it promoting fairness and a better social outcome? And I have about 30 more, but I've taken up all the air in the room, so I'll turn it over to the next.
I think we're ready for the next question. Thanks for that window into how the sausage is made, Dan. I totally relate to the internal pressures, though, of being inside a company where the pressure to deliver is so great, like cost and schedule reigns supreme. And so it does feel to me like it's a luxury sometimes to have equity-centered design decisions or consequences that go outside of your organizational consumer system and outside into the world at large. But I like your questions and the ability for us to at least plant a seed of those impacts with something as simple as a question. So let's see, the next question. So, I always like to think about the boundaries of solution sets for these sorts of problems, and I think that there's organizations taking ownership over their ethical decision making internally. Then there's oversight by some third party, whether it's regulatory or legal, perhaps even. And then there's the individual. There's education of the consumer, and how do I, as a person, empower myself to consume responsibly and to know the pitfalls and the risks of that consumption. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about, where do you see the boundary in terms of, organizations being responsible for themselves versus oversight by a third party versus, individual accountability? Where do you think we should be paying the most attention to in terms of solutions and where they lie?
I have a small thing to add into that. I think it's helpful to think of organizations as a bit more than just the organization, because of course there's always a difference between what leadership wants, what the investors want, and what the practitioners want. And I think we've generally had a fairly good last 150, 200 years of engineering practice, and there's a civil engineering, bridge building, all those sorts of things through the use of professional societies and professional ethics, where you're addressing the specific ethics of the practitioners who have the expertise that allows you to create this stuff. So even though you might have a financial person who wants you to do things in a particular way, we generally have a very good job, have a really good professional regulation there. So it's not that the organizations are regulating themselves so much as the profession within the organizations or across the organizations is regulating itself. So I think that's a useful lens to add.
Again, I'm not within a company, and I kind of touched on this before. Maybe surprising, but my kind of instinct is not to go straight to regulation. I think there's a lot that, as you said, that industry can do. I think medical ethics provides something of a model for this kind of stuff, and maybe that's a thought. But yeah, I think as much as we're walking into the unknown a little bit here, and I know you guys are technicians, and you'll tell me that it's much further ahead than I think, and I'm sure it is. But the fact is, we're at the beginning of something rather than at the end of it, and so I think there's a lot of questions to ask, and I suspect there's a lot of conversation that could be happening within the industry before we reach necessarily for regulation. Nevertheless, as I said earlier, I do believe that there are certain things that you can prescribe for. There are certain things that I think we can almost universally agree are wrong. For example, augmenting a school with pornography. I think we can all agree, don't do that. Why don't we start to think about the things that we can agree are not ethically permissible, and then think about the other things that might be slightly on the borderline.
I'm going to push back a little bit on some of this. It's very easy to leap to regulation or even ethics boards, and it's very hard to do an ethics board well. We saw Google had one for a day? Was that how long it lasted? Something like that. I'm glad they tried. Good on them. Part of the danger with having an ethics board is then you are absolving people like myself of having responsibility. Because then someone who's actually doing the work in the trenches can say, oh, that's the problem of the ethics board, or that's the problem of the trade organization. And they'll figure it out, and then they'll punish me, or some sort of thing will come in after I've already gone really far down this path. So the extent to which we can actually bring the ethical concerns to the people who are making the day-to-day decisions will be more and more beneficial. I don't know how always to make that, but it's a great thing. The other thing I want to say is, again, the press releases that you're seeing every week about AI and face recognition and all that stuff, that's all fine, but until people have actual incentives. In other words, we have things at most companies, tech companies, like they're called KPIs, or what you're judged on at your annual review. Nowhere in my annual review is my pay or my bonus based on did I make ethical decisions. It's based on, did I ship things on time? Did I collaborate with people? Did I, make these industry alliances? But nowhere is there anything about ethics, or did I, include more voices in the room or something like that. So until money, and actual money and pay follows these kinds of really important things, we won't see real demonstrable institutional changes amongst the people who are making these decisions.
I want to react to that a little bit because I've been buried deep in the world of medical institutional review boards of late, because we're trying to kick off some studies in a clinical setting, and there's an awful lot of stuff in there. And the idea that regulatory boards and ethics boards don't work, I agree that they often don't work. I don't think that means that they cannot work. My experience with working with these in this medical context is, so for an example, VT is a technical company. We're 20-something people. We're mostly engineers, artists, and some designers and some product managers. We don't have anyone in there other than me who is really steeped in sort of the academic research side of things, but we're working with some research partners who are very, very deep in there. And so in order for us to participate in some studies that we're kicking off at the moment, I had to get some of my team to go off and do some of this ethics training so that they could be involved in writing some protocols and submitting things through it. And there was a sharp and distinct change in the way that people talked about issues as a result of doing this training and as a result of being involved in writing the minutiae of protocols. So I think there's definitely ways to do these sorts of things that work. I think there's some big problems with how medical ethics review boards work, particularly around they tend to overemphasize, well, my experience has been with institutional review boards is you'll spend an awful lot of time writing about how you're going to handle totally trivial harms that are obvious, and virtually no time spent on serious harms that are not obvious. So, for example, I once did a project on building tabletop strategy games using augmented reality 15 years ago, and the bulk of what the ethics board wanted me to talk about was the fact that there was some animated violence in this, and would this concern the participants in my study. Given that the people in my study were tabletop wargamers, I wasn't really expecting that they would. However, there's a lot of this, and that particular one, I would have expected them to pay more attention to issues around simulator sickness and dizziness and all those sorts of things, because that was the sorts of things that could easily result, given the the crappiness of augmented reality in 2004, could easily result in someone hurting themselves. I know because I've hurt myself in AR during that period. So there are definitely drawbacks to the way that IRBs are implemented. It's a very slow process, but I think there's some lessons that can be taken from there. One of which is that these committees work, or these processes work, because they have regulatory teeth. It's not just that someone has voluntarily said, hey, we'll have an ethics board and we'll ask them some questions and maybe we'll choose to follow them. It's that you must submit these things there. If you don't, you become increasingly liable towards things. In healthcare, for example, and this isn't really the ethics, well, this is a different type of ethics, it's privacy ethics. In HIPAA regulation, the penalties that you are assessed for breaches in privacy or confidentiality are variable based on what precautions you have explicitly taken to prevent that from happening. So if you lose a certain type of health information and you have done all of the things that you're meant to have done and you report it quickly and you basically dot all the I's, cross all the T's, the penalty can be as low as like $100 per person's data that's lost. If, on the other hand, you have failed to do some of those things, the penalty is a few hundred times higher than that. So this strongly incentivizes companies to pay careful attention to this. And so you could imagine regimes in privacy in virtual worlds that account for this. You could probably imagine regimes in how do we present the comfort level or the which triggers exist in a virtual environment, or what about this content might be manipulative, such that if a harm occurs, we can then go look back at the process that was followed to get to that particular piece of content and see, was this done properly? If it was done properly and we learned something because a mistake was made that we didn't anticipate, okay, that's a mild offence and we penalise accordingly. If, on the other hand, you have been flagrant and you have decided you just don't care about these things, you've cut corners, you haven't followed your proper documentary trail, maybe you assess more. I'm not saying that's necessarily the most practical as described right there, but I do think there are ways that you can take these things and do them right that are different to what Google's ethics board that lasted a day. That's humorous. That's honestly very disappointing that's how it gets done, because that's what I mean by ethics washing, right? You do it. You got the headline. You've said, hey, we've done this ethics thing. We've considered some issues, and here are our recommendations. We're not going to do anything with them. But don't tell anyone that. That's very frustrating.
Thanks. I feel like within the healthcare industry, it's the boundaries, the ethical boundaries are slightly more objective, due to laws like HIPAA, and even just physical safety is another thing that's more clearly definable than mental safety, for example.
And also the ways in which you can mess with someone, I think, are it's not that healthcare doesn't affect every part of our lives so much as that any particular aspect of healthcare that you're interacting with at any one time is generally fairly well narrowly defined, whereas you go into a virtual reality environment and almost all of these issues we're talking about could become relevant.
Yeah, no, they're really good points. And I like how everybody's kind of focusing on different pieces of the puzzle, like in response to individual accountability versus organizational versus systemic or regulatory. I think the answer is all of them, kind of like the question about climate change earlier, like we have to be doing everything. So I do want to open it up for questions, but before I do, I'll just have one more question for the panelists, and it's about predictions. It's about which of the issues that have come up are really the most urgent, the most pressing, and what should we be paying the most attention to in terms of, what poses the greatest risk for us. Share your thoughts, please.
Sure. So, obviously, as I've stated, I'm really interested in AR and VR, and particularly AR, if it's true, it's going to become this ubiquitous platform. What that means in terms of what they call decision guidance processes. So, those of you who've heard of behavioral nudge, like what that means within that context. The data, basically, our commercial kind of masters, and I hate to use that kind of language, and I don't normally, but I fell into it, hold an enormous amount of data about us. And if we're going to be using AR, they're going to be also harvesting, as I've said, biometric data. The informational imbalance between user and deployer is about to become extreme, I think. And where there is commercial incentives for those people to, as I say, marshal us around the immersive, interactive environments. They have dynamic real-time data on us, don't forget, as well. I worry a little bit about how those people are taking decisions or forcing decisions on our behalf. So if you believe that who you are as a human being, that is constituted by the choices that you make, the haircut that you have, the partner, the way you live, the school that you went to, the clothes that you wear, if you believe that those things make you who you are, then you should be slightly worried that potentially an external entity whose objectives are not the same as your own could be swaying you or shepherding you in particular directions to make decisions and choices that are actually motivated by their needs and not your own. I think that's a pressing concern, and I think it's something that we should all be tracking.
Pretty much everything she just said. I've spent a bunch of time with folks who are sort of, in organizational leadership, but who are on the sort of the commercial masters types people, or commercial masters' sons, kids whose parents are in this sort of thing and are well steeped in this. And it seems the number one thing they all want to talk about is behavioral economics, and that scares the crap out of me. I really don't want to live in that particular dystopia. So that's a very far-reaching issue. I'm going to mention as a prediction sort of thing, a more pedestrian and sort of incrementalist type thing. A thing that I like in the VR space, and I think will probably end up propagating to the AR space, is the fact that the platforms, the store platforms, the app platforms, generally do a fairly solid job of advising you on aspects of the experience that you're about to enter into so that you can make a considered opinion about whether you should or not. Now, they focus primarily on what they call comfort, which usually means, do I get simulator sickness? Am I going to get sore eyes? All of those sorts of things. But in today's climate, we have a lot of talk around trigger alerts and around warning people of the consequences, warning people that this piece of content or this thing that I just wrote might upset you in a particular way, or it might have this kind of effect on you. And I think that though there's probably some excesses in that space, I've been in places where people have demanded trigger alerts for things that are considered very normal and you would see every day. And that may be excessive, and that's a different question. But I think the fact that we're in this world where we do talk about this and we do expect creators to take some level of responsibility for the way in which people react to their content, at least within reasonable expectations, I feel like that has the potential to inform how we design these platforms. And I'm predicting and hoping that the people who are building the ways in which we get access to AR and VR content in the not too distant future are going to start offering those sorts of advice. I've heard this talked about, so I think that's a really positive development if it happens. And if anyone is in the room and is working in that space, I'd love to hear more whether you guys are doing this. I think it would be great.
Thank you. First, I'll say yes and everything said previously. So even though I'm in the trenches, I also try to take a very long view of this. And I have a values ladder, and sort of up at the top is, is this making a better world? To get to that, I have to ask, are these technologies making us more compassionate for each other, with the assumption that compassion leads to connection between people? So if I think about something like glasses, are they going to bring me more connection to people around me who I can help and care about, or are they going to give me less? Seemingly simple test to state, but much harder to actually ask. So for all of the kinds of decisions I'm making in my day-to-day world, I use that kind of lens. Is this increasing my compassion for people or decreasing it? And, there are many vectors and ways to get there. Of course, I believe one of the best one is diversity. And I don't mean diversity of thought, like, oh, I believe this and this and this. I mean actual diversity of different kinds of people who are making things. It's very hard. You'll hear people on my side of the table say the pipeline issue and all that other stuff. So I spend a lot of time mentoring people who don't look like me, trying to bring them into the field of where they're making things. On the positive side, I also, anecdotally start noticing in the world that the next generation coming up has a more nuanced view of the world than I do, that they are able to engage with cognitive dissonance in a way that I may not feel as comfortable. I have a 13-year-old daughter who, can grapple with things like gentrification, objectification, deconstruct advertising, but she also still likes reading People magazine. I mean, she can do both of those at the same time, whereas I bring a much more sort of, straight and narrow view of things. So I invite myself, as I start wandering through this landscape, to give more credit to people, as long as they're empowered, that they can actually view the world in a more nuanced and pluralistic way. And then I have a whole bunch of predictions, but we can talk about those later.
Love it. Thank you. You just gave me permission to not feel so guilty about my trashy magazine habit. Consuming with open eyes. All right, so let's do questions. I see one here in the front here.
Yeah. So just to flip the conversation a little, we've talked a lot about very valid concerns from VR and AR tech and some of the possible ways to address those. But just to help us sleep better at night, maybe, I'd be curious to hear the opposite side of the conversation. Some of the things that you're excited about in VR and AR tech that could impact society in a positive direction. Like obviously we've heard about a little bit about virtual therapeutics, treating some behavioral health conditions. I imagine diagnosing and treating mental illness is in the mix, and I'm curious to hear what else is out there.
Sure. I mean, there's a huge laundry list that companies like mine like to tout, so I'll start running through some of them. So it could be emotion coaching, either for normally abled people like me or people who are somewhere on the spectrum. That's a wonderful thing. Scale. With scale means that I can amplify the ability for people to experience things that are wonderful that they can't normally experience. So there may be the world's best math teacher, but if I'm at an underserved school, I may not be able to experience that person, or I may not be able to be on Everest or go into a pyramid. So scale allows that to be amplified across broader worlds. If I'm differently abled and I'm in the physical environment, things like this could help me understand where curb cuts are, or which businesses are more able to accommodate me, or what the wait times are going to be for that bus that has the wheelchair lift, so that I have, a greater chance of having a more equitable experience than somebody else. I am very interested in how I can use these things to help me focus. I'm someone who has a lot of, I'm very distractible. There's probably a lot of reasons behind that. But if I can wear these shutters in some sense that can help me feel more confident in what I'm doing, can give me little rewards, maybe a little gamification, give me a little Greek chorus that's cheering me on, awesome. I'll take it.
I definitely want a Greek chorus to cheer me on. That sounds great. For me, the two big areas of improvement to humanity that I'm most interested in from these technologies sort of fit around two things. One of them is about moral improvement, about using these technologies to help us be better. So, Dan, you were talking about thinking how you think about things through how have I increased my compassion in the world today as being an essential value. I think there's a lot of ways, like VR is an immensely persuasive technology. You can use this to do an awful lot. So I'm very interested in how can we use this family of technologies to make people more want to engage in better ways morally, thinking from other people's perspectives, being more compassionate, being more sympathetic, being more empathetic. All these things are subtly different, and so forth. And then B, making it easier to do so by giving you the information that you need to do it. So, for example, instead of saying, "Hey, right now I need to stop being angry about my own issues and start listening to their thing," that's really hard to do, right? Because your own issues are really loud in your head. But if there's some way that I'm able to sort of ambiently understand that something's going on. So, for example, I'm not amazingly great at noticing when someone is upset or why, unless I get them to tell me. So I'm always asking these questions because I like to know these things because it helps me respond. But asking someone to say how they feel doesn't necessarily result in them, A, responding well to the question because they might be angry that you had to ask, or B, necessarily gets them to be honest because people often don't know like what their body language is saying and what they are thinking they're feeling are different things. So if we can use technology to help us in those ways, I think that's really interesting. And then the other space I'm really interested in, and this is more on the AR side, is the ability of this family of technologies to improve our ability to function and process information. So I'm talking about everything here from giving access to information that helps keep me motivated, giving me access to information that helps me break down the tasks that I'm doing, remember things, all of that sort of stuff, that whole sort of family there. I'm a big user of sort of quantified self-type techniques, and I have been long interested in how do we use these things to help enhance our memory, enhance our cognition. I have a little fun little story I might share quickly. I had an experience at a conference in 2004 with a guy called Thad Starner, who is a early researcher in wearable technologies and augmented reality. His team did some wonderful weird AR games back in sort of the late 90s. But anyway, I was introduced to him. I'd never met him before. Introduced to him, and he walked up to me and he looked me directly in the eye in like a really firm and assertive way. And I was slightly taken aback by this. And he put his hand out. He shook my hand and he said, "Oh, you're Trond Nilsen." And I'm like, "Why are you using my last name? What's up with that?" What I didn't realize, and I kind of saw it at the time, but I didn't click in my head, was that the little black thing in the corner of his glasses was a camera. He was taking a photo of me for the computer he had on his waist, so that he had a record of who I looked like to help him remember these things later, so that his system could recognize my face and prompt me. I have no idea how good his system was, but that type of thing of helping me remember things that I'm probably not going to be good at. There's questions about dependency here, but I would definitely find it very helpful to have someone remind me of names without having to, go and quietly whisper with them in the corner before I start a conversation. So these are the sort of families, the moral improvement and the sort of memory and cognitive improvement, I think, are the things I'm most excited about.
I'm not a maker, but just as a quick rejoinder to the idea of having this kind of augmented memory, I was at a conference at Stanford a couple of years ago, and I forget the guy's name, he's one of Apple's kind of big wigs, was presenting an idea of a technology that he was working on which did exactly that, and there was an augmented element to it, which was, and his kind of big sales piece was, imagine a world where you're at a cocktail party and you remember everybody's name and everybody thinks you're fantastic. And there was a guy who put his hand up, and I'm going to completely and utterly butcher this because I'm not a neuroscientist in case you haven't noticed, but he put his hand up and said, "But did you know the thing in the brain that makes you forget things is an addition? It's not a lack. It's something that is actually evolved." I mean, I can see people nodding, and I'm sure you know more about it than I do. And so I think as we think about augmenting our experiences, I mean, I'm just trying to throw this out there as an idea. I don't really have a particularly evolved thought on it, but it is interesting to me that we're trying to sort of evolve in a way that counters our own natural evolution if we're trying to do that. So I just think it's an interesting thought, that's all.
Excellent. All right, we've got another couple questions.
Hi, thanks for being here today. Dan, you were talking a little bit earlier around kind of the community impacts of VR and AR. And it seems that we're all kind of centered around how AR and VR can impact us individually and the benefits it can have to us. And I think we think about technology in that lens very often. But maybe if all of you guys could share how we could be thinking more about it in terms of social interaction and communal interaction.
I have a real quick one from my perspective. We work in Virtual Therapeutics, works on chronic stress, chronic anxiety, chronic pain. All of these things here massively impact people's ability to interact with each other. When you're in pain, it's really hard to interact with others, which means you're more likely to misinterpret what they say, to be stubborn and not listen to their perspective. I feel like if we can use these technologies to even slightly heal people in that space and teach them some of these things, and actually some of the techniques you need to use to address chronic pain and anxiety is to teach them the cognitive behaviors that let them do that. So from my perspective, yes, we are helping the individual, but the benefits to society of that are huge.
What I'm going to say is not original by any stretch, but as everybody who talks about AI and building data models, if everybody has these things and all of these things are collecting our data, then, by fiat, you will have a more equitable data collection. That's a little scary, but it also means that, someone who's in a homeless tent, their data is going into the model, just as someone who's up in a skyscraper, their data is going into the model. So that's one side of it. If we think about things that have happened before, like those wonderful projects where they give cameras to kids, this is before phones, if there was a time before them, when we gave cameras to kids who were in the inner city and we said, tell your story, or just do something with this. Likewise, if we give these devices that allow people to be part of the global conversation, that is a way of empowering certain communities. Of course, feeding back into what everybody else is saying, that we have to understand that the algorithms that are controlling which of that data is then surfaced, that's something we have to address. But the short answer is, how do you give more people a voice?
Yeah, I mean, this is a nice opportunity for me. I'm not a Luddite. I might be a compatriot of the Luddites, but I'm not. And I think technology has an amazing role to play in opening up democracy and really kind of handing the reins to communities who haven't had a voice. I'm not from the AI for Good community. That's a very specific community kind of within the branches of our AI ethics. But I mean, there really are case study after case study of the ways that technology is being used right now across the world in terms of helping communities unlock resources, deploy them properly, improve processes. I mean, we've just had the government and tech conversation, and I think some of the potentiality was discussed there. But yeah, I think there's a plethora of different ways that this stuff could be used to improve all of our lives, and indeed is being used to improve all of our lives. From my perspective, I just want to push that note of caution out there as well, to make sure that we're not bulldozing ahead without thinking about unintended consequences further down the line. It's greasing the wheels in terms of just making things better, I guess.
Hi. I have two very packed questions, so hopefully you can talk to them. But my first one is, I know we talked a lot about the speed and how you have to sort of deliver, and things are based on cost and just getting it out there. But how do we move from that model? How do we get away from that and change the system? Because there seems to be this tension, obviously, that there needs to be consideration, but then it has to meet the bottom line. So how do we force that system to change to be better? Why can't all AI be for good, even if it is not necessarily a social impact for good? Why are we not considering these ethics more at the foundation of these creations? And how do we get the people who are pushing us in these systems to get out faster to actually consider these questions? And then my second question is more based on the maker side, which is about accessibility. And I know we talk a lot about AI and this future, but why are we living in this world where technology lives here and accessibility and what the people's needs live on a dichotomy? Whereas simple things like AI, for me, the first question is, what about people who are visually impaired? What about women who get seasick? What about financial accessibility? So or people that don't like things on their head. I mean, these seem like really basic foundation questions to me, but we're just pushing forward. AI, VR, all these things. So why are we not considering those, and how do we have those as the center point of our making and our movement of society forward, rather than just we'll deal with that when we get there. Let's test it out. But why isn't this the first question we're asking, and how do we change that system to get there?
I think that the second question is, in many ways, a practical question, because you can't start thinking about, you sort of, the way you develop things tends to be incremental. You tend to think about, how do I solve the easiest situation? Okay, now that I've solved this, how do I solve the next one? So there's an inherent bias in the way that you have to think about solving problems that forces you to do the the easiest thing first. So that hits on some of the issues around accessibility. Not all of them, but it does hit on some of them. I don't buy the argument that they are completely separate poles of existence. I think the financial incentives you mentioned in the first question kind of push them in that direction, because there's a simple fact of most of the time when you're dealing with accessibility issues, you're dealing with people who make up a minority of the population, and that minority doesn't spend as much as the majority. And strangely enough, the people who are selling things want to sell to the biggest group first, at which point we get into the first question. That said, I think there is an awful lot that is being done, and I don't buy the idea that they're separate planets, because I see a lot of people who are very passionate about these things and who are on both sides of this. So I feel like it may have been more that way once, but it's certainly these days. Practitioners, I mentioned earlier the difference between large corporate creators of content and all the small people that we see coming to events where it's 3-person teams working on an interesting project. They are very, very interested in these questions. So I guess I kind of reject the basic premises of the question. I think if we reframe it as how do we get the large organizations to care about this, then it starts to become an economic question, and that sort of starts to get to the point you had originally about how do we get them to think other than just the raw financial value, and I'm guessing that Dan has an answer to that.
Oh, I'm sorry, I got to cut you off. We are at time. Such a rich conversation. I'm sure you want to hear some more responses to that. I would invite you all to approach our really brilliant panelists at any point throughout the day to continue the conversation. Please join me in thanking them for their wisdom and insight.